I died the year you hated me most. A dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Celeste Arnoux. Part 1. The Excavation. I have been dead for 5 years when they finally dig me up. The officer leading the excavation is the head of the Criminal Investigations Unit of the Lyon Police Department. His name is Mathieu Sarraud. He is 38 years old, and he has not shaved in 4 days, and there are shadows under his eyes so deep they look like bruises. He is also the man I was going to marry. I watch from above as the forensics team works the site, a decommissioned industrial yard on the outskirts of Villeurbanne, the kind of place that has been slowly returning to weeds and mud since the factory it served closed in the late 90s. The November rain falls on their yellow protective suits and on the hard-hatted heads of the crime scene technicians and on Mathieu, who stands at the edge of the excavation with a cigarette between his fingers and his collar turned up against the cold. He does not look like the Mathieu I remember. The Mathieu I remember was 26 years old and laughed at things with the specific wholeness of a person who is not yet practiced at managing what they feel. That person has not entirely disappeared from this one, but he has been compressed by years into something harder and more deliberate. The line of his jaw is sharp. The set of his shoulders is permanent. He looks like a man who has spent a long time in the company of difficult things and has learnt to move through them without breaking, which is not the same as being unbroken. A technician calls out, "Something has been found." I watch Mathieu put the cigarette out against the heel of his boot and step forward and crouch beside the excavation with the efficient focus of someone doing a thing they have done many times. He brushes mud from an object with 2 fingers, and the object becomes visible, and the object is a ring. A plain silver ring with a thin channel of blue enamel running around its circumference. He had given it to me on the night we graduated from the police academy in Paris, in the rain outside the building, with no particular ceremony, just the 2 of us and the rain, and his hands around mine and the ring and the question. He looks at it for a long time. He does not move. He does not speak. Around him, the scene continues. Voices and equipment and the particular professional noise of a complex forensic excavation, and he is inside all of it, and also entirely elsewhere. I have never seen a person go so still so quickly. It is like watching a photograph being taken of a living person, the moment before the expression is fully resolved, the moment of absolute internal suspension. Then he puts the ring in his palm and closes his fist around it, and the sound he makes is not quite human. It is the sound of something fundamental giving way. "Mathieu, I am right here. I am right above you. I can see your hands shaking even from here." He cannot hear me. I have been a ghost for 5 years, and I still have not entirely accepted that the people I most need to reach cannot receive me. Part 2. What I was. My name is Celeste Arnoux. I was born in Montpellier in 1986. I grew up in the apartment above my grandmother's pharmacy on the Rue de la Loge, a narrow street in the old town that smelled of lavender oil and bread in the mornings, and jasmine from the courtyard in the evenings. My grandmother was a precise and practical woman who wore her hair in a bun that never varied, and who believed that the most useful things in the world were knowledge, patience, and the correct application of both. I learned from her the habit of careful attention and the discipline of seeing things as they actually were, rather than as I would have preferred them to be. My mother was her daughter, but did not particularly resemble her. My mother was warm in ways that were sometimes more useful and sometimes less, and she loved my father with a completeness that left only a small room for everything else, including sometimes me. This was not cruelty. It was the specific way that very large loves can crowd out smaller things without meaning to, and I understood it and did not resent it, though I understood it more clearly as I grew older. My father was a detective with the Montpellier police. He died on duty when I was 11, which is the kind of fact that sounds like a complete sentence but is actually only a beginning. After he died, the apartment above the pharmacy became quieter than I had known it to be, and my grandmother became larger in my life. And I began to understand that the most reliable things in the world are the things you build for yourself from materials that cannot be taken away. I enrolled in the police academy in Paris at 20, which is the fact about me that made most people in Montpellier react in one of two ways. Either they said your father would be proud, which was probably true, and which I accepted, or they said, why would you do that after what happened to him, which was the less interesting question, because the answer was obvious to me from the time I was 12. You do the thing that matters because it matters. The fact that it costs something does not remove the reason to do it. At the police academy, I met Mathieu Sarraut. He was from Lyon, the son of a school teacher and an architect. Physically very different from the mental image I had carried of what a police officer ought to look like, which was probably my father's image rather than any objective standard. Mathieu was tall and thin and had a habit of tilting his head when he was thinking that made him look perpetually on the verge of a question. He laughed easily. He had opinions about film that were more developed than the situation called for. He fell asleep in lectures with an equanimity that suggested he was entirely unbothered by this fact. We became friends in the second month. We became more than friends in the sixth. By the time we graduated, he had given me a ring in the rain, and I had said yes without needing to think about it, which is the only answer to that kind of question that can be trusted. We were both assigned to Lyon. We worked in different units. I was in the organised crime division and he was in criminal investigations. And we had an apartment on the Quai de Seine with windows that faced the river and the Fourvière Hill and the basilica that sat on top of it, like an architectural declaration of faith. We were 27 years old and we had work that mattered and a city we were learning together and each other, and I was in a way that I did not examine closely enough at the time because I was too busy being inside it, genuinely and completely happy. That ended as things that are genuinely and completely good sometimes end with a decision I made alone and did not share with him, and the consequences of that decision which neither of us could have anticipated, and only one of us survived. Part 3, The Undercover. The operation had been in development for 18 months before I was assigned to it. The target was a narcotics distribution network that operated across the Rhône Valley, from Lyon to Marseille, sophisticated in its financial engineering, and protected by layers of legitimate business structures that had been specifically designed to make the movement of its product appear, to anyone who was not looking very carefully, as ordinary logistics. The previous undercover officer assigned to it had been compromised at the 6-month mark and had been extracted. The operation had been rebuilt from the beginning. The decision was made to use an officer with no existing profile in the network's territory, someone whose face was not known to any of the people who needed to be approached. My name came up in that conversation because I had been building a parallel track on the financial side of the network for 14 months, and because I spoke Italian, which was relevant for reasons related to the network's manufacturing connections in the north. I was asked if I was willing. I said yes. I did not tell Mathieu. This was not a simple decision, and I want to be clear about that. I did not keep it from him carelessly or because I underestimated what it meant. I kept it from him because the operation required complete compartmentalization, and because he was in a different unit with different clearances, and because telling him would have placed him in an impossible position that would have served neither of us well. These were the operational reasons. They were real and they were sufficient. But I want to be honest about the other reason, the one I did not examine at the time as directly as I should have. I also kept it from him because I knew he would be afraid, and because watching Mathieu be afraid for me was something I did not know how to carry, alongside everything else the operation was going to require of me. His fear was specific and generous. The fear of a person who loves someone and understands their profession clearly enough to know exactly what its dangers look like. Carrying that would have meant carrying him, and I was not certain I could afford to do that and also do the work. So I said nothing. I told him I had been transferred to a specialist economic crimes unit for a long-term project, which was partially true. I moved out of our apartment into a cover apartment in the Guillotière district. I became over 3 months of careful construction someone named Sofia Romano, who had grown up in Turin and worked in supply chain management and was looking for opportunities in Lyon's import-export sector. I was inside the network within 4 months. I was there for a year. I will not describe the year in detail because the details are not relevant to what I am trying to tell you, and because some of them are still classified, and because the details of undercover work inside a narcotics network are the kind of details that exist to serve the operation, not to serve the person conducting it. And the person conducting it is the one narrating this account. And she would prefer to tell you what matters rather than what was operational. What matters is this. During that year, I gathered evidence that was sufficient to dismantle the network, identify its senior leadership, and provide the prosecution with a case that would ultimately result in 7 convictions, including 2 for reckless endangerment causing death. 17 people were eventually prosecuted on evidence I gathered. The network has not reconstituted itself in the years since, and on a Tuesday night in October, in the 4th floor apartment of a warehouse building on the outskirts of Villeurbanne that was being used as a distribution node, I was compromised. I do not know precisely how. This is one of the things that happened in that room that I was not able to understand fully in the time I had. There were 3 of them. The operation leader, whose name I will not use here for reasons that are still legally active, and 2 men who worked for him. They had understood in the days before that Tuesday that Sofia Romano was not who she claimed to be. They had been careful and methodical about confirming this, the way careful and methodical people do things when they are managing a situation they understand to be dangerous. What they did not know was that I had already transmitted everything. The chain of documentation, the financial records, the operational logs, the identities. All of it was already with the unit commander. I had made sure of that in the week before because something had shifted in the network's behavior in those days, and I had felt, in the way that people who have been paying careful attention feel things that a threshold was being approached. This turned out to be accurate. On that Tuesday night in October, they took me to the industrial yard in Villeurbanne, which was one of the network's established sites for the disposal of things it no longer needed. I was 29 years old. I was thinking in those last minutes about the basilica on the Fourvière Hill and the windows of our apartment that faced the river, and Mathieu's habit of tilting his head when he was thinking. I was thinking that I was sorry I had not said goodbye. That was the last thought I had as Celeste Arnaud. Then there was nothing. And then there was the formless, weightless state of being I have been in for 5 years watching. Part 4, the accusation. In the immediate aftermath of my disappearance, the official investigation reached a conclusion that I understand now from 5 years of watching was based on incomplete information combined with a fundamental misreading of what had actually happened. The conclusion was this: Celeste Arnaud had gone over. The evidence supporting this conclusion was, I can see now, not unreasonable, given what the investigators had access to. I had been inside the network for a year. The network had gone to some effort in the months before my death to generate documentation, suggesting that their Sofia Romano had become genuinely complicit in certain financial arrangements. This was deliberate. It was a long-prepared contingency, the kind that sophisticated criminal organizations maintain against the eventual probability of an embedded officer. In the event of discovery, they had material ready that would muddy the picture enough to complicate any straightforward prosecution. It did complicate it, combined with the fact of my disappearance, which in the absence of my body was interpreted as flight rather than death. The picture that assembled itself in the weeks after October looked to the people examining it like an officer who had been turned and had run. The unit commander who had been receiving my transmissions was killed in a traffic accident in December, 6 weeks after I disappeared. I watched this from above, and I cannot tell you whether it was arranged or coincidental because I genuinely do not know, but I know that it removed the person best placed to confirm the legitimacy of what I had been doing. and its removal changed the shape of the available evidence significantly. By the following spring, there was an official finding. Celeste Arnault was listed as a fugitive officer suspected of having compromised the operation in exchange for an exit and a share of the network's assets. Her engagement to Mathieu Sorot was noted as context for why he had been excluded from any knowledge of her assignment, and the exclusion, which had been appropriate and procedurally correct, was reread in this new light as something more deliberately concealing. I watched this happen and I could do nothing about it. But more than any of this, more than the official finding or the professional consequences, what I watched and could not intervene in was what it did to Mathieu. I watched him read the finding. I watched him sit in the apartment on the Quai de Seine, the one with the windows facing the river and the basilica, and not move for a very long time. I watched the understanding arrive in him. Not quickly, not cleanly, but the way understanding arrives when it is the worst possible version of the thing you could have been told, a comprehensive, organized devastation. He did not cry. The Mathieu I had known would have cried. This Mathieu had already been doing the work. In the months of my absence of managing the grief of a disappeared person, the specific suspended grief that does not know whether to mourn or to wait. The finding ended the suspension and replaced it with something harder. Not grief exactly. Something that had grief inside it but was organized around a different center. He began from that point to look for me, not to find me. He believed I was alive, believed it with a furious certainty that I watched consume him for 5 years. He was looking for me the way you look for someone you intend to bring back, and the bringing back he intended was not gentle. He wanted to find me and make me answer for what he believed I had done. I watched him build the case against me across 5 years. I watched him compile the evidence, pursue the leads, travel to Zurich and Brussels and Palermo, following threads that led nowhere, or led to people who had been dead for longer than I had. I watched him work with the specific focus of a man who has organized his entire existence around a single purpose, and I understood what I was watching, which was not really about justice, or not only about justice, but about the need to have somewhere for the enormous and unresolvable feeling to go. He hated me. For 5 years he hated me the way only people who have loved something completely can hate it when they believe it has betrayed them. I watched this hatred and I did not blame him for it. But watching it was its own kind of dying, separate from and in addition to the first one. The silver ring with the blue enamel channel had been on my hand when I was buried in the industrial yard in Villeurbanne. When he found it in the mud, holding what was left of me, everything he had organized himself around for 5 years became suddenly impossible to maintain. That is when I became a problem he could not solve by hating. Part 5, The Boy. There is something I have not told you yet. The most important thing. I was saving it because the order of information matters when you are trying to tell a truth completely, and this is the truth that everything else arranges itself around. I have a son. His name is Luca. He is 6 years old. He was born 7 months after I died, which means I was 2 months pregnant on that Tuesday night in October in the warehouse building in Villeurbanne. And I did not know it, or I had a suspicion that I had not yet confirmed, which amounts to the same thing in terms of what I carried into that last night. Luca was born to my mother, who was named as my next of kin and who received the official finding about me along with everything else, and who, when she understood that I had been pregnant, did not ask questions about the father, but simply incorporated this new fact into her understanding of the situation and continued. My mother is not a simple woman. She is warm in ways that crowd out other things, but she is not simple. She brought Luca from Montpellier to Lyon when he was 18 months old. I do not know all the reasons for this decision, and I was not able to ask her. But I watched her bring him, watched her settle into an apartment in the Croix-Rousse district of Lyon, watched her begin the particular life of a woman raising a grandchild in a city that is not her own, for reasons that are complicated and that she has never tried to simplify. Mathieu did not know Luca existed for the first 3 years of Luca's life. When he found out, it was because Luca, who has been able to see me since the beginning and has never found this particularly unusual, since children approach the impossible with a pragmatism that adults have generally lost, walked up to Mathieu in the park near the Tete door and said in the direct and unself-conscious way of a 3-year-old, "My mama is here. She says you are sad." Mathieu crouched down to the level of this small person he had never met and said very carefully, "What is your name?" Luca said, "Luca Arnaud. Maman says your name is Mathieu." I watched from the bench nearby and held my breath, which is something that ghosts apparently still do when they are afraid. Mathieu looked at this child. He took in the particular combination of features that was neither mine entirely nor his entirely, but was the specific, unrepeatable combination of the two of us. The shape of the eyes that were mine, the particular angle of the jaw that was his. The way the child tilted his head slightly when he was paying attention, which was a gesture that had come from nowhere except biology, and that I had watched Mathieu make 1,000 times. He said very quietly, "Who is your mother?" Luca said, "Celeste. She is right there, but you cannot see her." Mathieu sat down off the ground in the middle of the park path, which is not something adults generally do, and he stayed there for a long time. Part 6, what Mathieu learned. After the park, things moved differently. Mathieu found my mother. This was not difficult once he knew where to look, which was Léon, which was the Croix Rousse. He rang her bell on a Saturday morning and she opened the door and looked at him for a moment with the eyes of a woman who has been expecting this conversation for some time and has been both dreading and needing it. She made coffee. They sat at her kitchen table. She told him things she had not been able to tell anyone else, because the official version of events had placed her in the position of the mother of a disgraced officer, which is its own specific and terrible loneliness. The grief that cannot be spoken without risking the anger or the judgment of people who have decided what the truth is. She told him about my father, about growing up above the pharmacy, about the way I had always moved toward the difficult thing rather than away from it, which she had understood, since I was small, as both a quality she admired and a quality that kept her awake at night. She told him about the phone call she had received 2 weeks before I disappeared, which she had not reported to anyone because she had not understood at the time what it meant. She said I had called her at night, not late around 9, and said nothing about where I was or what I was doing, only asked how she was, and whether the jasmine in the courtyard of the old pharmacy building was still blooming, which it was, and whether she had spoken to my grandmother recently, who had been ill, and whether she was sleeping well. Ordinary questions. The questions of a person taking the inventory of the things they love before putting it away somewhere safe. She told him that she had been afraid when I disappeared, and that the fear had changed character when the finding was published, had become something more complicated than simple fear had become the particular experience of being told that the person you knew and the person officially described were different people and being expected to choose between them. She said I chose her. I always knew her. The report did not change what I knew. Mathieu sat with this. He began from that point to rebuild the case from the beginning. Not the case against me, the case for me. He did it in his personal time off the books, without the institutional resources of the department, the way people do things when the institution is part of the problem. He pulled the original evidence. He found the financial records that had been generated by the network to create the impression of my complicity, and identified with the careful attention of an experienced investigator the specific ways in which they had been manufactured. He traced the unit commander's accident. He found 2 dock workers who had been present when one of the network's senior members had discussed the problem of the officer. They had discovered a conversation that had happened 3 weeks before my death. It took him 2 years. 2 years of working alone in the evenings and on weekends while also managing his unit and learning badly, and then less badly, to be a father. Because he was learning to be a father, after the park, after the kitchen table with my mother, he came to Luca 3 times a week. He was not comfortable at first. He had not been around children in any meaningful way. And Luca was specific and demanding and fully formed in the way that young children are fully formed, already completely himself, already in possession of opinions about things that Mathieu had not previously considered to be subjects, about which a person could have opinions. He was tentative with him in a way that I found painful to watch the tentativeness of a man who is terrified of making a mistake with something that matters this much. But Luca did not require him to be comfortable. Luca simply included him. This is one of the things young children do that adults are incapable of replicating. They incorporate new people into the existing structure of their world, with a straightforwardness that makes the new person feel, despite themselves, that they have always been there. Luca showed him his drawings. He explained his theories about which cloud shapes were most likely to become rain. He fell asleep on Mathieu's shoulder during a film they were watching together when he was 3.5, and I watched Mathieu sit perfectly still for an hour. Afterward, not wanting to move the sleeping child, looking at the ceiling with an expression I did not have words for, I said quietly into the room, "You are going to be all right." He could not hear me, but he sat very still for a long time, in the specific stillness of someone who is receiving something. Part 7, Luca sees. Luca has always been able to see me, but this is not something I have ever been able to fully understand or explain. I have been present to him as a visual presence since before he could speak, and his relationship with me has been the uncomplicated relationship of a child with a parent, characterized by the specific and matter-of-fact love that children extend to the people who are simply part of their world. He does not find my state unusual. He does not ask why I cannot be touched, or why other people cannot see me. He asks the questions he wants answered and accepts the answers and moves on to the next thing, which is the appropriate and efficient relationship with the nature of the world that children have before they learn to call things impossible. He told Mathieu that I was there because I asked him to. I am going to be honest about this because honesty is what I promised at the beginning. I sent my son to a man in a park to introduce himself because I needed Mathieu to know that Luca existed, and I could not tell him myself. This was not a thing I did without thinking. It was a thing I thought about for a long time, with all the considerations laid out carefully. And it was still, when I instructed Luca to do it, one of the hardest decisions I have made in any state, living or dead. Luca was not frightened. Luca is not generally frightened of things. He has a quality that I recognize as coming from me, though I am not certain whether it is inherited or transmitted through the specific intimacy of our particular form of contact, a quality of proceeding toward difficulty with the expectation of managing it. He walked up to the stranger in the park and told him what he knew and waited to see what would happen. What happened was Mathieu on the ground in the middle of the path. What happened afterward was everything else. There were moments during those 2 years of Mathieu rebuilding the case when Luca served as an intermediary in ways that I am not sure were entirely appropriate, and that I managed as carefully as I could. Luca would pass to Mathieu from me things that helped, not the documentary evidence which Mathieu was finding himself, and which could not arrive through the testimony of a small child, but the interpretive things, the contextual information that pointed him toward the right reading of the documents he found, the direction in which to look for the dock worker conversation, the name of the person who had manufactured the financial records. These were things that I transmitted through Luca in the form of questions and observations that a perceptive child might reasonably be imagined to have arrived at through his own experience of growing up in the orbit of this story. Mathieu was careful about this. He accepted what was useful and did not ask questions that would have been impossible to answer. He was in this specific way the person I had known he was when I agreed to marry him. He understood the nature of what was happening without needing to name it. He worked with what he had. And then 2 years after he had found Luca in the park, he submitted the reconstructed case file to the Departmental Review Board with the specific and economical cover memo of a man who knows that the quality of the documentation does the arguing. The review took 4 months. Part 8, The Inquest. There is a colleague of Mathieu's whose name is Valerie Dupuis. She has been in the department for 16 years. She is methodical and ambitious, and she has always found Mathieu Sarraud's refusal to either move on from me or to adequately perform grief to be an inconvenience. I watched her during the 2 years he was rebuilding the case attempt several times to persuade him to drop it, and I watched him each time refuse in the patient and definitive way that a person refuses. Things they have already decided are not available for refusal. She had her own theory about me. The theory was not malicious, I want to be clear about that. It was the theory of a person who had worked from the available evidence and had reached a conclusion that was consistent with what the available evidence suggested. She believed I had gone over. She believed that Mathieu's inability to accept this was the reaction of someone who had been personally very close to the subject and was not for that reason the best positioned person to evaluate the objective picture. This was not an unreasonable position, but it was wrong. The review board found in my favour. I was watching from above when the notification arrived. Mathieu was at his desk in the unit office and he read the document once, all the way through, then set it down on the desk, then picked it up and read it again. He did not show any visible reaction for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the parking area and stood there for several minutes. His colleague, Benoit, who had been at the adjacent desk and who was the only person in the department who had believed in the reconstruction from the beginning, said, "Well?" Mathieu said, "Yes." Benoit said, "What do you need?" Mathieu said, "I need to go pick up my son from school." He left. Benoit watched him go with an expression that I recognized as the expression of a person who has watched someone they care about carry something very heavy for a very long time and has just watched them be allowed to put it down. My rank was restored. My case file was amended. The official record now contains the correct version of events, which is that I was an undercover officer who gathered evidence sufficient to dismantle a significant narcotics network over 14 months and who was murdered on the night of her extraction. 7 lives were directly attributed to the network's activities during the period of my operation. I am credited with the intelligence that prevented further ones. My mother came to the notification ceremony. She wore the coat she saves for formal occasions, a grey wool coat with a velvet collar that she has owned for many years. She sat in the front row and held her handbag in her lap and watched the proceedings with the specific composure of a woman who has held herself together through things that should not have been survived. And she did not cry until the end when she was handed the official Medal of Commendation. And then she cried very quietly for a short time and then she stopped. Luca was beside her. He was wearing the small suit that my mother had bought him for the occasion, which he had complained about because the collar was tight, and which he had eventually agreed to wear because Mathieu told him that it was a suit for honouring his mother, and he had agreed that this was a valid reason. He sat very still during the ceremony with his hands in his lap, and at one point he looked directly at the place where I was standing and smiled. Mathieu was in uniform. I had not seen him in uniform in 5 years. It still looked right on him. He looked like what he was, which is the best thing you can look like. After the ceremony, he stood for a long time in front of the photograph of me that had been placed on the memorial wall of the department, the one from my graduation year, taken outside in the sun, in which I am laughing at something that had happened a moment before the photograph, and which I have long since forgotten. He did not say anything. He just stood there. I stood beside him, my shoulder an inch from his, and did not say anything either. Part 9, The Excavation again. I want to go back to the beginning, to the industrial yard in Villeurbanne, and the rain and the November mud and the silver ring. I want to go back because that moment contains something I have not fully described, and the description matters. When Mathieu found the ring and understood what he was holding, the 5 years of hatred that had organized him collapsed. Not immediately. The collapse was not a single moment, but a series of moments across an afternoon, each one undoing something that had been structured very carefully to hold. He sat beside my remains for 3 hours after the forensics team had finished their work, while the rain continued and the portable lights threw hard shadows across the mud. He sat with the ring in his palm. I sat beside him as close as I could get, which was not close enough. I have spent 5 years not being close enough. I want to tell you what I understood in that time watching him. I understood that the hatred had been a form of love. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and I am not saying it to be comforting. I am saying it because it is accurate. The hatred had the specific character of love that has been deformed by the conviction of betrayal. It had the same dimensions, the same intensity, the same refusal to diminish or to be replaced. He had hated me for 5 years with the completeness and the exclusivity with which he had loved me. And the reason both of these states were possible in him was the same: he was a person who did not do things by halves. I understood sitting beside him in the rain in the industrial yard that this was one of the things I had loved about him. The completeness, the refusal to manage his feelings down to a size that was more convenient for everyone around him. I had loved this in him, and I had, in the decisions I made in the last year of my life, not extended him the trust that this quality deserved. I had protected him from the knowledge of what I was doing in a way that I believed was correct and operational. And that was also, I can see now from the longer perspective, that death provides a form of not trusting him with the full version of things. I would have done it differently if I had known. I cannot say exactly how. The operational reasons were real and they still were real. But I would have found a way to tell him something, even if it was only the shape of the thing, only the outline of the risk. I would have trusted him with more of it. I did not have the chance to do this. But I have had 5 years to understand it. And the understanding has been something I have carried into every moment of watching him rebuild the case and learn to be Luca's father and put the cigarettes down and pick them back up and put them down again. And it has made what I have been watching something more than simply the continuation of a grief. It has been, in the specific way that the dead can have this, a form of ongoing love. An attention that contains everything I did not say. I said it into the rain that night. I said it into the cold air of the industrial yard, while the forensics team packed their equipment and the officers milled around, and Mathieu sat still with my ring. Mathieu, I am sorry. I was wrong to keep it from you. You deserved more trust than I gave you, and I am sorry. He could not hear me, but he sat very still for a long time in the rain. And at some point, somewhere in that long stillness, something changed in him. The quality of the stillness shifted. It became less like something held and more like something settling. I am not going to tell you that he heard me. I do not know whether he did. What I know is that the person who stood up from that mud and walked to his car was not entirely the same person who had arrived there. Something had been released. Some locked thing had been opened and the contents allowed to move. Part 10, the 3 months. After the review board finding, I had approximately 3 months. I understood this not as a deadline that anyone communicated to me directly, but as a felt certainty, the way certain things are known without being announced. The work I had stayed to do was done. The record was corrected. Mathieu had the truth. Luca was known and loved and in good hands. My mother was in Lyon, near the people she needed to be near. I had 3 months to witness what I had set in motion and to say what I had not yet said through whatever channels were available to me. The first month was Luca's birthday. He turned 7. My mother baked a tarte aux fraises with lavender sugar, which was a recipe from the pharmacy district of Montpellier, from my grandmother's kitchen, that she had not made since I was a child. Luca sat at the table in the Croix-Rousse apartment with Mathieu on one side and my mother on the other, and ate his tart with the focused appreciation of someone who is very serious about food. Mathieu had brought balloons. Too many balloons, a truly excessive quantity of balloons, which Luca had catalogued with the expression of a person receiving something that exceeded their expectations, and was not sure yet how to respond. I sat at the table in the empty chair that had always been left at family meals. in our old apartment, the chair that nobody sat in and watched my son turn 7 with his father and his grandmother, and the memory of a mother who was still there, somehow still watching, still present in the particular way that love persists beyond the form it originally inhabited. I transmitted to him through the channel that existed between us and that I do not entirely understand. I am here. I see you. You are exactly who you were always going to be, and I am so proud. He looked up from his tart directly at me and smiled. The second month was a Sunday in March. Mathieu and Luca went to the Parc de la Tête d'Or with a bag of stale bread for the ducks, which is the specific and unvarying ritual they had developed over the years, and which Luca regarded with the proprietorial seriousness of a person whose traditions matter to him. I watched them from a bench. Mathieu was in civilian clothes, a grey coat, the kind of nondescript weekend coat that a man wears when he is not thinking about what he is wearing. Luca walked beside him with the bread in both hands, explaining something with the detailed earnestness that characterized his explanations of everything. They looked like a father and a son at the park on a Sunday, which is what they were, which is a complete and sufficient thing to be. At some point, Mathieu sat on the bench beside me, the bench where I was, and looked out at the lake and the water birds and the March light on the water, and said to no one visible or to the air or to the version of me that he had been speaking to internally for 5 years, I know you are here. I said, yes. He said in the same quiet tone, I know what you were doing. I know why you kept it from me. I am not saying I would not still have wanted you to tell me, but I understand why you did not. I said I should have trusted you with more of it. He said probably, but you were also trying to protect me, and that was not a wrong thing to want to do. The ducks quarrelled over the bread that Luca was throwing. Luca shouted instructions at them that they ignored. I said, he is going to be all right. Mathieu watched our son negotiate with the ducks. He said, yes, he is. I said, so are you. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, still to the air, still to the version of me that was right there beside him, I kept your ring. I know that is strange. It is not strange to me. I wear it on a chain. I have worn it for years. I said, I know, I have seen it. He said, I am not ready to let go of it. I said, you do not have to. He said, but I also know that you would tell me to live. You would be very direct about it. You would say, Mathieu, do not be foolish, which is a phrase you used a specific number of times when I was being particularly obtuse about things. I laughed. He could not hear it, but I laughed. I said, Mathieu, do not be foolish. He smiled, a small private smile addressed to no one visible. Luca came running back from the pond with a report about the ducks that required immediate attention, and Mathieu turned to receive it with the full attention that Luca's reports always deserved. I sat on the bench in the March light and watched them. Part 11, the third month. The last month was April. The city was doing what Lyon does in April, moving from the flat, grey light of winter toward a tentative warmth. The plane trees coming cautiously into leaf, the Saône running high with the snow melt from the Alps, the Fourvière Basilica, catching the morning light in the particular way that made it look from the river less like architecture and more like a declaration. Mathieu had the ring on the chain under his shirt. He had been wearing it since the excavation, since the ring had been cleaned and returned to him after the forensics processing, since the day he had threaded it on the chain that had been on his desk in the apartment since the night of my disappearance, when he had found the chain and not found me and had kept the chain without knowing why. I had 3 weeks left and I knew it. Luca knew it too. Children know these things in the body rather than the mind, in the specific way that children know things that have not been explained to them, the way they respond to emotional temperature, and to the subtle changes in presence that signal transitions. He was quieter than usual in those last weeks. He drew more. He drew pictures that I asked him about, pictures of a woman with dark hair standing in a field of light, which he explained to me was what he thought the place I was going looked like. I said, that is a good guess. He said, will you be able to see us from there? I said, I believe so. I think the seeing does not stop. He considered this with the serious attention he gave to everything. Then he said, "Will you still be you?" I said, "I think so, the essential parts." He said, "The part that loves me." I said, "Especially that part. That is the most essential part." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to his drawing. On the last evening I was in the apartment. My mother was making dinner, the same beef and wine stew that I had made in the apartment on the Quai de Seine, the one with the windows facing the river, on the last normal evening I had had before the operation began. The recipe had come from my grandmother from the pharmacy kitchen in Montpellier. My mother had written it out for Luca in a notebook she was keeping of recipes and family stories, a project she had begun as a form of transmitting things that deserved to be transmitted. Mathieu was at the table with Luca helping with homework. The homework was multiplication. Mathieu was not, it turned out, as useful with multiplication as he considered himself to be, and Luca was correcting him with the brisk patience of a 7-year-old who has realized that adults are not infallible and has decided to be gracious about it. I sat in the chair that was always left empty. The light in the apartment was the warm yellow light of evening, the light that I have always associated with the specific quality of a safe place, a place where the outside world is outside, and the inside world is held together by the particular force of the people in it. I looked at my son. I looked at the man who was going to raise him. I looked at my mother who had carried the impossible weight of grief and uncertainty and the official condemnation of her daughter for 5 years, and who was still here, still cooking, still making the recipe from the pharmacy kitchen in Montpellier. I thought about my father who had died on duty and who had given me by dying as he did, the understanding that the things worth doing are worth their cost. I thought about my grandmother and her bun that never varied, and her belief in knowledge and patience and the correct application of both. I thought about all the years I had not had, the years that should have been mine and were not, the years I had watched from above instead of lived. I will not tell you this did not grieve me. It grieved me deeply. A life not fully lived is a real loss, one that does not diminish with time or with the consolations of purpose and meaning. But I also thought about what I had done with what I had, and I did not believe I had wasted it. I had done work that mattered, and I had been present in it completely. I had loved the person I chose with the completeness that the choosing deserved. I had given that love at the end, in the form of a child who was sitting at a kitchen table correcting his father's multiplication. I thought that is not nothing. That is in fact everything. Part 12, The Colleague. I want to tell you about Valerie Dupuis because she is part of this story, and leaving her out would make the story simpler than it actually was. She was 32 years old when I disappeared, 4 years older than me, already further advanced in the department than her years would suggest, because she was competent and disciplined and worked with a focused efficiency that the institution recognized and rewarded. She had come up from Grenoble, the daughter of a civil engineer and a nurse, and she had the specific quality of people from mountain cities, a directness that could read as severity, but was actually the personality of someone who grew up in a place where the weather required honesty about conditions. She did not dislike me when I was alive. I want to be clear about this. Our relationship was professional and occasionally warm and occasionally slightly competitive, in the way that colleagues in the same institution who are at similar career stages and who both take their work seriously are sometimes competitive, not viciously but with an awareness of each other as benchmarks. We were not close. We did not socialize outside the department. But we worked well together on the cases that overlapped. And I respected her accuracy, and she respected what she called my instincts, which she said with a slight edge that suggested she found instincts less reliable than methodology, but was willing to concede that mine had a better than average success rate. After my disappearance, she became the person on the team most committed to the official finding. This was partly professional. She had reviewed the evidence and reached a conclusion, and she defended her conclusions with the consistency of someone who considers changing her mind without new evidence to be a form of intellectual dishonesty. But it was also something else that I watched over years with careful attention. She had feelings for Mathieu that she had never acted on and had never allowed herself to make obvious feelings that predated my death and that had existed alongside her professional relationship with him, with the specific difficulty of something that is real and cannot be acknowledged. After I disappeared and the finding was published, the combination of the genuine professional certainty about my guilt and the personal wish that the finding was true made her certainty harder than it would otherwise have been. I watched her over the years attempt to be present in Mathieu's life in ways that were careful and deniable. She brought files to his apartment when cases required it and stayed longer than the files required. She was thorough and attentive in her support of him during the years of reconstruction, though her support was complicated by her certainty that what he was reconstructing was a false narrative. She was good to him in the particular way of someone who loves carefully and from a distance, and has decided that this is what the situation permits. When the review board returned its finding in my favour, she read the document at her desk. She sat with it for a long time. Then she went to Mathieu's office and closed the door. I was there. I watched. She said I was wrong about her. He looked up. She said, I am telling you this directly because you deserve to hear it directly, and because anything less would be dishonest. I was wrong about what she did and why she disappeared. The evidence I was working from was manufactured, and I did not identify it as manufactured, and I should have looked more carefully. I am sorry. He said, Valerie. She said, I am also telling you because I am aware that my certainty about the finding was not entirely objective. I am aware of that now, and I was not fully aware of it at the time. And that lack of awareness affected my analysis, and I am sorry for that as well. He said very quietly, you do not need to apologize to me. She said, I think I do. He said, you were working from what you had. Everyone was. She said, you were not. You kept looking. He said I had reasons to keep looking that other people did not have. She stood in his office for another moment. Then she said she was a good officer. He said she was the best one I knew. Valerie nodded once. She left the office. I watched her walk down the corridor with the straight back and the focused efficiency of someone who has done something difficult and necessary and is now returning to the work. I thought about her for a long time afterward. I thought about the specific difficulty of being a person who carries a feeling that cannot be honoured in the way it deserves, and who manages that difficulty with integrity by not acting on it at the expense of someone else. She and Mathieu never became what she perhaps once hoped, but they became over the years. Something else that was real and had its own value, the kind of friendship that is built on the foundation of having been through something difficult together. That is not nothing. That too is a form of love. Part 13, My Mother. My mother is 61 years old when the review board returns its finding. She is sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the notification has been delivered by post. She reads it twice, she puts it down, she picks up her coffee. She looks at the window and at the lavender she keeps on the south-facing balcony, Provençal lavender, the high-altitude variety, the kind my grandmother kept in every room of the pharmacy in Montpellier. She says to the room, which is empty except for me, I knew. I say, I know you knew. You always knew. She says, still to the room, I told them. I told them from the beginning who she was. She is quiet for a long time. Then she picks up her phone and calls her oldest friend in Montpellier, a woman named Marguerite, who has been calling her every Thursday evening for 4 years to check on her, which is an act of friendship so consistent and so undemanding that it is its own form of heroism. My mother says, Marguerite, it is done, they have corrected it. There is a sound from the phone. My mother says, yes, she was always who I told you she was. She says quietly, I am going to be all right, do not worry about me. She puts the phone down. She goes to the balcony and touches the lavender with 2 fingers, the way she always touches plants to feel them, to confirm their living presence. I stand in the kitchen behind her and watch the south-facing light on the Croix-Rousse rooftops and think about how much I love her. Not the soft, decorative love of a daughter for a mother who has never demanded anything difficult. The specific, enormous love of a daughter for a mother who held everything together when everything was broken, who chose me over the official version of me, who brought my son to the city where his father worked and let what needed to happen happen. I say into the lavender-scented air, thank you. With everything I have, thank you for Luca, thank you for staying, thank you for knowing. The lavender moves slightly in the October air. My mother stands on the balcony for a long time. I think she hears something. Part 14, The Ring. I want to tell you about the ring one more time. He bought it in a small jewellery workshop near the Place des Vosges in Paris, 3 months before our graduation. The craftsman there had a skill with what he called meaningful simplicity, the ability to make something that said what it needed to say without requiring embellishment. Mathieu specified the silver and the thin channel of blue enamel because blue had been my grandmother's favourite colour, which he had learned from a conversation he had apparently been listening to more carefully than I realised. The ring was made over 3 weeks. When he came to collect it, he asked for an engraving on the inside of the band. What he chose to put there was the number 212. I did not know what this meant when he gave it to me in the rain outside the academy. I asked him and he said 212 days since we met. Since the lecture hall in the first month. I have been counting. I had not been counting. I had not known he was counting. I looked at him in the rain and at the ring and at the number inside it and understood something about the quality of the attention he had been paying the specific and unhurried attention that I had identified as one of his defining characteristics, and understood that he had been paying it to me precisely since the beginning. He wore the ring on the chain for 30 years. In the process, the engraving inside wore down, the way all inscriptions wear down, that are kept close to a living body, rubbed continuously against the warmth of the skin. By the time he was old, the number was almost invisible. You would have had to know it was there to find it. He knew it was there. He wore it until the wearing made it almost nothing. And the almost nothing was the form it took into the last room, the form it kept when everything else had been reduced to its most essential, and what remained was love and the evidence of duration. That is what I remember most, not the beginning, not the ring in the rain. What I remember most is the image of the ring on the chain worn smooth, the inscription invisible, carried against the body for 30 years. That is the truest form of what happened between us, not the dramatic events, not the operation or the death or the 5 years of watching or the excavation in the mud. All of that was the context. This is the center. 212 days since we met, I have been counting. Epilogue, 30 years. What I am about to tell you I know not from watching, because I will not be watching in the same way, but from a certainty that I carry with me as I prepare to leave. The certainty of a person who has loved well and been loved in return, and who understands from that experience how the story ends. Mathieu does not remarry. He does not make this decision dramatically or announce it to anyone. It simply becomes over the years the shape of his life, and it is a shape he has chosen and that fits him. He becomes in the department a legend of a specific and practical kind, the kind generated not by theatrics, but by an extraordinary and sustained capacity for careful work. He closes cases that other people have given up on. He does not give up on things. He raises Luca with my mother's help, and his own slowly developing the skills that nobody is born with and that only accumulate through the patient repetition of showing up. He learns to cook eventually, with moderate success. He maintains the tradition of Sunday afternoons at the Parc de la Tête d'Or until Luca is too old to find it appealing, and then resumes it when Luca has children of his own. He wears the ring on the chain until it has been worn smooth, the enamel channel gradually effacing itself through years of contact with the skin. When Luca is 16 and asks about it, Mathieu tells him the full story, which takes an evening, and Luca listens with the same complete attention he has given to everything since he was 7. And when it is done, he says, in the direct way that is very much my quality in him, she was good at her job. Mathieu says she was extraordinary. Luca says, I know, she told me. Luca grows up and does the thing that was perhaps inevitable, the thing that is the continuation of both parents by other means. He enters the police academy. He is a natural. He has my attentiveness, and Mathieu's patience, and something that belongs to neither of them individually, but is the specific product of the combination and instinct for the interior of situations, for the human element within the structural one, that makes him very good at the work that requires both. On the day he graduates, Mathieu stands outside the academy in the sun, in a manner that I hope contains some echo of the afternoon, 30 years earlier, when he stood outside the same building in the rain and held a ring and asked a question. Luca comes out through the doors in his new uniform, and Mathieu puts his arms around his son and holds on. Luca says she would have loved this. Mathieu says yes, she would have. Then Mathieu grows old. He grows old in the specific way of men who have lived carefully and strenuously, slowly, with the wounds of an active career beginning to make themselves known in the body, the joints and the old injuries that are the tax on a long life of difficult work. He retires on a clear October afternoon and goes home to the apartment on the Croix Rousse, which has been his home since my mother left it to him when she moved back to Montpellier in her late 70s, and he sits in the chair by the window that faces the Fourvière Hill, and he holds the smooth ring in the palm of his hand. He falls asleep in the afternoon light. In his last sleep, he sees something, not a memory exactly, something more immediate, the courtyard of a place that has no specific address, open and full of a particular light, warm without being harsh. And in the courtyard, a woman with dark hair who looks up and sees him and says his name with the specific quality of someone for whom that name is the most important word in the language. He walks toward her. This time there is nothing between them. Luca comes home that evening and finds his father at peace in the chair, the smooth ring in his open palm, the expression on his face, the expression of a man who has at last arrived somewhere after a very long time on the road. On the table a note in the careful handwriting of an old man. Do not grieve, I have gone to meet her. Tell the boy I am proud of him. The white curtains at the window move in the evening air. Outside, the Fourvière Basilica catches the last light of the day, in the way that it has always caught it, the way it will keep catching it after all of them are gone. The declaration written in stone on the hill above the river, persistent, faithful, still standing. End. I Died the Year You Hated Me Most is an original dramatic narrative set in Lyon, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or to actual organizations or events, is entirely coincidental.